Welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Tonight we travel into the thin air of the Andes, where clouds drift like ghosts and the stones still whisper the names of kings. This is the story of the Inca, a forgotten empire of sun and stone, of gods and gold, of brilliance and betrayal. Long before the name Inca was spoken in reverence, before great cities rose from mountain peaks like prayers carved in stone, the Andes breathed with the dreams of countless peoples. In valleys where mist clung to terraced slopes like memories, where condors traced ancient paths through air so thin it seemed to touch the heavens themselves, civilizations bloomed and faded like flowers in an eternal spring. The mountains remembered everything. They remembered the first footsteps of humans crossing frozen passes, their breath clouding in the rarefied air as they descended into valleys green with promise. They remembered the Chavin, who carved their jaguar gods into temple walls with such devotion that the stone itself seemed to purr with divine presence. The wind carried whispers of the Nazca, who drew lines across the desert floor so vast that only the gods could read their meaning from the sky above. But it was in the highlands, where the air grew thin and the sky stretched endlessly blue, that something extraordinary began to stir. Around the sacred lake of Titicaca, where water met sky in a mirror of eternity, the Tiwanaku built their first temples. Here, in this cradle between earth and heaven, they learned to speak with stone, to convince massive blocks of andesite and sandstone to rise from the earth and arrange themselves in perfect harmony. The lake itself seemed alive with possibility. Its waters, dark as obsidian and still as prayer, reflected not just the sky, but the dreams of those who gazed into its depths. Fishermen would cast their nets at dawn, watching the surface ripple with silver light as totora reeds whispered secrets to the morning breeze. Children learned to read the patterns in the water, to understand the language of waves and wind that had been spoken here since the world was young. As generations passed like seasons, the knowledge grew. The Tiwanaku discovered that the sun wasn't merely a source of light and warmth, but a living deity whose moods could be read in the dance of shadows across their terraces. They learned to work with the rhythms of rain and drought, to coax life from soil so high above the sea that strangers would gasp for breath just walking across it. Their farmers became artists, painting the mountainsides with crops that cascaded down in ribbons of green and gold. The Wari followed, spreading their influence across the highlands like morning mist rolling across the peaks. They built their cities not as conquests, but as conversations, each settlement a response to the unique personality of its mountain, its valley, its relationship with the sky. Their roads began as whispers of connection, paths that wound through passes where the air sang with altitude and the stars seemed close enough to pluck like flowers. But the mountains held their breath, waiting for something more. In the valleys around what would one day be called Cusco, small communities of people learned to work together in ways that seemed almost magical. They called themselves the Quechua, speaking a language that rolled like water over stone, that would describe 17 different types of snow and 47 shades of sunset. They understood that survival in these peaks required not just strength, but harmony, not just courage, but wisdom. The air itself seemed to carry possibility. At night, when the temperature dropped and the stars blazed with an intensity that made the eyes water, the old ones would tell stories. They spoke of Viracocha, the creator god who had emerged from the sacred lake and breathed life into the world. They whispered of Inti, the sun god whose golden face smiled down on the valleys each dawn. They dreamed of Mamakila, the moon goddess who painted the peaks silver and watched over the sleeping world with eyes like pools of starlight. These were not just stories, but blueprints for understanding. The people learned to read the relationship between earth and sky, to understand that the changing seasons were not random, but part of a vast conversation between divine forces. They began to see themselves not as separate from nature, but as participants in a cosmic dance that had been choreographed before the first human breath. The terraces they built were more than farming innovations. They were prayers carved into the living rock. Each level followed the natural contours of the mountain, creating landscapes that seemed to flow like water while remaining solid as stone. The farmers who worked these terraces moved with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the earth itself, their tools extensions of their hands extensions of their understanding. In the evenings, when the work was done, and the sun painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, families would gather to share meals that tasted of the mountain itself. Quinoa that had been blessed by altitude, potatoes that carried the memory of frost and thaw, corn that held the sweetness of rare highland rain. They ate not just food, but communion, understanding that each bite connected them to the soil, to the weather, to the endless cycle of seasons that governed their lives. The children grew up breathing air that was half atmosphere, half dreams. They learned to walk on paths that seemed to lead directly into the sky, to play games that prepared them for lives lived at the edge of possibility. Their laughter echoed off canyon walls and returned changed, carrying with it the wisdom of stone and the promise of wind. And still the mountains waited. In the distance, peaks that had never felt human footsteps gleamed with snow that had fallen before the first word was spoken. Glaciers moved with the patience of gods, carving valleys that would cradle civilizations not yet dreamed. The very bedrock seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if the earth itself knew that something unprecedented was about to unfold. The shamans felt it first. In their dreams, they saw visions of cities that would rise from the peaks like thoughts made manifest. They saw networks of roads that would bind the mountains together like sinews in a vast body. They saw people who would learn to speak with the sun itself, to organize their lives around the rhythm of celestial dance, to build an empire that would stretch from desert to jungle, while remaining rooted in the thin air of the heights. But for now, it was still just whispers in the mountains. The condors circled overhead, their wings catching thermals that rose from valleys still unnamed. The wind carried the scent of distant snows and the promise of rains that would come in their season. And in the settlements scattered across the highlands, people lived and loved and dreamed, not knowing that their children's children would inherit the world. The sacred fire burned in temples made of living rock, tended by priests who had learned to read the mood of the divine in the flicker of flame and the quality of smoke. The fire never died, fed by offerings of coca leaves and chicha, by prayers that rose with the embers toward stars that seemed to lean down to listen. This was the constant heartbeat of the highlands, the rhythm that connected every village to every other, every person, to the vast web of existence that pulsed through the Andes like blood through veins. As the seasons turned and the years flowed like water down the mountainsides, the knowledge accumulated. Not in books or scrolls, for these people did not write with ink, but in the memory of the elders, in the patterns of the textiles, in the arrangement of stones that would endure long after the hands that placed them had turned to dust. Every skill was a prayer, every tool a sacred object, every harvest a celebration of the eternal partnership between human will and divine grace. The children listened to the stories with eyes that reflected the mountain sky, their imaginations kindled by tales of gods who walked among mortals, of heroes who could speak with animals, of places where the earth touched the heavens and magic was as real as the air they breathed. They learned that they were not just people, but participants in a story that had been unfolding since the world began, that their lives were threads in a tapestry being woven by forces beyond their understanding, but not beyond their love. And in the distance, where the peaks caught the first light of dawn and held it like a promise, the future waited. A future that would see small communities grow into mighty cities, scattered tribes unite into a single voice that would echo across the continent, and the whispers in the mountains become the songs of an empire that would shine like gold in the high mountain sun. The birth of an empire. In the heart of the Andes, where the air was so thin that strangers struggled to breathe and the sun blazed with an intensity that made the eyes water, a valley cradled a dream that would become legend. The valley was called Cusco, though its name would one day ring across the continent like a bell announcing the birth of gods. Here, among terraces that stepped down the mountainsides like green prayers, a people called the Quechua began to weave themselves into something larger than the sum of their villages. The story begins with a man whose name would outlive mountains, though he started as nothing more than a chief's son in a settlement no different from dozens of others scattered across the highlands. Manco Capac, the chroniclers would later call him, though his real name was lost to time, like morning mist dissolving in the first rays of sun. What mattered was not what he was called, but what he became. The thread that pulled together the scattered communities of the valley into a pattern that would spread across the known world. The transformation did not happen overnight, like a thunderclap splitting the sky. It unfolded slowly, like a flower blooming in the mountain spring, each petal a decision, each decision a step toward something unprecedented. Manco Capac looked at the valley around him, at the terraces that climbed the slopes like staircases to heaven, at the streams that laughed their way down from the glaciers, at the people who had learned to live in harmony with altitude and wind and the moods of the sky. But he saw more than what was. He saw what could be. In his dreams, visited by visions that came like gifts from Inti himself, he saw the scattered communities connected by roads that would bind the mountains together like sinews in a vast body. He saw armies that moved not as conquerors, but as brothers, bringing the gift of order to peoples who had lived in isolation for generations. He saw a civilization that would rise from the peaks like a prayer answered, that would stretch from the waters of the great lake to the edges of the world. The first step was the hardest, convincing the elders of his own village that their destiny lay not in the quiet continuation of old ways, but in the bold embrace of something new required all the patience of a man who had learned to read the moods of the mountain weather. He spoke to them in the long evenings when the work was done, and the peaks glowed with the last light of day, his words carrying the weight of prophecy and the warmth of dreams shared. "We are children of the sun," he told them, his voice carrying across the settlement like wind through the quinoa fields. "But we live like orphans, each family separate, each village alone. The condor does not forget it has wings. The glacier does not forget it shapes the valley. We must not forget that we are meant to be more than the sum of our parts." The words took root slowly, like seeds planted in the thin soil of the heights. The people looked at their neighbors with new eyes, seeing not strangers, but family members they had not yet met. They began to understand that the skills that made them strong as individuals could make them invincible as a united people. The weavers whose textiles captured the colors of sunset, the farmers who coaxed life from rocky soil, the builders who could convince stone to stand in perfect harmony. All of these gifts were threads in a tapestry that had not yet been woven. The first alliances were formed not through conquest, but through marriage, through the sharing of festivals, through the gradual recognition that what united them was stronger than what divided them. Village by village, family by family, the idea spread like water, finding its way down the mountainside, following the natural contours of kinship and shared tradition until it pooled in the valley that would become the heart of everything. Manco Capac chose his bride not just for love, though the chronicles whisper that Mama Oclo's beauty was like dawn breaking over the peaks, but for what she represented: the union of communities that had lived separate lives, the weaving together of the bloodlines that would create something stronger than either could achieve alone. Their wedding was celebrated not just in their own village, but in settlements throughout the valley, a festival that lasted for days and nights, with music that echoed off the canyon walls and dances that seemed to make the earth itself move in rhythm. The children born of this union grew up understanding that they were not just individuals, but symbols of possibility. They learned to speak not just to their own people, but to the wind, to the stone, to the spirits that lived in the high places where the air was too thin for ordinary breath. They were taught that leadership was not about commanding, but about listening, about reading the needs of the people like a skilled weaver reads the pattern in her loom. As the years passed, and the first generation of the unified valley grew to adulthood, the vision expanded. What had begun as a dream of local unity grew into something vast and ambitious. The young men and women who had been raised on stories of connection and cooperation looked beyond their valley to the peaks that rimmed their world, wondering what lay beyond, what other peoples might be waiting to hear the message of unity that had transformed their lives. The first expeditions were not armies, but embassies, groups of skilled speakers and gift-bearers who traveled the mountain paths with offerings of friendship and invitations to share in the vision that was transforming the valley. They carried with them textiles of such beauty that they seemed to glow with their own light, pottery that sang when the wind touched it, and most importantly, stories of a way of life that offered something precious to peoples who had lived in isolation. The promise of being part of something larger than themselves. Some communities welcomed the visitors with curiosity and eventually with enthusiasm. Others required patience, time to overcome the natural suspicion of mountain peoples who had learned to be wary of strangers. The emissaries understood that forcing change would destroy the very thing they sought to create, that true unity could only come from the heart, from the recognition that joining the growing confederation meant not losing their identity, but finding their place in a larger pattern. The sacred city began to take shape during these years, not as a planned construction, but as an organic growth that seemed to emerge from the valley floor like a dream made manifest. The builders worked with the natural contours of the land, their structures following the flow of the streams, the curve of the hills, the angle of the sun's path across the sky. They built not just with stone, but with understanding, each wall a meditation on the relationship between human vision and the eternal patience of the mountains. The Temple of the Sun rose slowly, its golden walls catching and reflecting the light in patterns that seemed to breathe with divine presence. The builders who worked on it understood that they were not just constructing a building, but creating a home for the God who had blessed their people with vision and purpose. Every stone was placed with ceremony, every joint sealed with prayers, every surface polished until it gleamed like captured starlight. But the true temple was not the building, but the community itself. The people who gathered in the growing city brought with them the skills and traditions of their homelands, creating a tapestry of knowledge that was richer than any single culture could have achieved alone. The potters learned new techniques from distant valleys. The weavers discovered dyes that created colors they had never imagined. The farmers found ways to grow crops that had been thought impossible at such altitude. The children of this new world grew up bilingual in ways their parents had never been, speaking not just Quechua, but the languages of stone and wind, of textile and song, of the complex relationships that bound their expanding family together. They played games that prepared them for lives lived in service to something larger than themselves. Their laughter echoing off walls that seemed to have been built not just by human hands, but by the dreams of the gods themselves. The first Inca took the name as he took the responsibility, understanding that he was no longer just a man, but a living symbol of the unity that had transformed scattered villages into the beginning of an empire. He was Sapa Inca, the only Inca, the voice through which the sun god spoke to his children on earth. The title carried with it not just authority, but obligation, the sacred duty to care for his people as a father cares for his children, to make decisions not for personal gain, but for the good of the whole. The royal court that surrounded him was not a gathering of flatterers, but a council of the wisest and most skilled from all the communities that had joined the Confederation. They brought with them the accumulated knowledge of their peoples, the understanding that had been passed down through generations of living in harmony with the mountains and the sky. The Inca listened to their counsel with the patience of a man who understood that true wisdom came not from commanding, but from synthesizing, from finding the common thread that could bind diverse voices into a single song. The laws they created were not arbitrary rules, but reflections of the natural order, guidelines for living that honored the relationships between people, between communities, between the human world and the divine forces that governed existence. They understood that justice was not about punishment, but about balance, about maintaining the harmony that kept the world from falling into chaos. As the empire took its first steps beyond the valley, growing like a tree that spreads its branches to catch more light, the people understood that they were participating in something unprecedented. They were not just building a political structure, but creating a new way of being human, a civilization that honored both the individual and the community, that sought to include rather than exclude, that understood that true strength came not from domination, but from the willing cooperation of free peoples. The sun set each evening on a world that was larger than it had been at dawn, and rose each morning on possibilities that had not existed the day before. The children of the valley had become the children of the sun, and their story was just beginning to unfold across the peaks and valleys of the endless Andes. Roads to the sun. The paths began as whispers traced by the feet of llamas, their soft padding creating lines across the landscape that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. But under the patient hands of the Inca engineers, these whispers became songs, and the songs became a symphony of stone and vision that would connect the scattered peaks of the Andes like a vast web spun by gods who dreamed of unity. The road builders were not ordinary men, but artists whose canvas was the living rock of the mountains, whose tools were not just hammers and chisels, but understanding that ran deeper than the roots of the ancient trees. They read the landscape like a sacred text, following the natural contours of the valleys, the rhythm of the rivers, the ancient migration paths of the animals who had walked these mountains since the world was young. To watch them work was to witness prayer made manifest in stone. They began each day with offerings to the spirits of the place, scattering coca leaves on the wind and pouring chicha on the ground, asking permission to reshape the earth in service of the vision that was spreading across the highlands like dawn breaking over the peaks. They understood that they were not conquering the landscape, but partnering with it, creating pathways that would enhance rather than violate the natural order. The first great road stretched from the sacred valley northward, following the spine of the Andes, through passes so high that the air itself seemed to sing with altitude. The builders worked in teams, each group responsible for a section that matched their particular skills and understanding. The men who worked the highest passes were chosen not just for their strength, but for their ability to read the moods of the mountain weather, to sense when the snows would come, and when the winds would howl with voices that could freeze the blood. They built not just for passage, but for permanence, creating structures that would endure long after the empire that birthed them had faded into legend. The foundations were laid with blocks of stone so massive that later generations would wonder how they had been moved, fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between them. But the builders knew the secret. They did not fight the stone, but listened to it, finding the natural points of connection where one block yearned to meet another. The roads themselves were marvels of engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. They carved shelves into cliff faces that dropped away into chasms so deep that the bottom was lost in shadow. They built bridges across gorges that spanned distances that made the heart race just to contemplate, using techniques that wove rope and stone together in patterns that seemed to have been taught by the spiders who spun their webs in the high places. But the roads were more than just paths for moving people and goods. They were the arteries of a living organism, carrying not just traffic, but information, culture, and the subtle connections that bound the empire together like sinews in a vast body. The chasqui runners who used them were more than messengers. They were the voice of the empire, carrying words that could travel from the great city to the farthest provinces in days, rather than the months such journeys had once required. Each runner was chosen not just for speed, but for memory, trained to carry messages that were not written down, but woven into the fabric of their minds with such precision that they could be repeated word for word after days of running through air so thin that ordinary men would collapse from exhaustion. They ran in relays, passing their messages from one to another at stations built along the roads, like beads on a string, their footsteps creating a rhythm that pulsed along the highways like a heartbeat. The stations themselves were marvels of hospitality and efficiency, built to provide everything a traveler might need. Food that had been prepared with the patience of people who understood that nourishment was a sacred act, shelter that protected against the harsh weather of the heights, and most importantly, the knowledge that they were welcome, that they had found a place where they belonged to something larger than themselves. The architects who designed these waypoints understood that they were not just building shelters, but creating experiences, spaces where the weary could rest and the lonely could find companionship. The walls were decorated with textiles that told stories of distant places, helping travelers understand that they were moving not just through space, but through a vast tapestry of human experience. The gardens that surrounded each station were planted with crops from across the empire, creating oases of familiar flavors that made even the most distant provinces feel like home. As the network expanded, growing like a tree that spreads its branches to catch more light, the roads began to shape the empire in ways that even the planners had not anticipated. Communities that had been separated by weeks of dangerous travel suddenly found themselves connected by paths that could be walked in days. Markets that had been local affairs became regional celebrations, bringing together peoples who had never met, but who discovered they shared more than divided them. The Great North Road climbed through passes where the air was so thin that the stars seemed close enough to pluck, descending into valleys where the climate was so different that travelers felt they had journeyed to another world. It crossed deserts where the sand dunes shifted like slow waves, where the builders had to understand not just stone, but the moods of wind and sand, creating pathways that could endure that endless dance of the elements. The coastal road followed the edge of the sea, where the builders had to work with different challenges entirely. Here, the enemy was not altitude, but humidity. Not ice, but salt spray that could corrode stone and metal with patient persistence. The engineers developed techniques for working with materials that could withstand the constant assault of the ocean, creating structures that seemed to grow from the cliffs themselves, as natural as the seabirds that nested in their crevices. But perhaps the most remarkable of all the roads was the one that descended into the jungle, where the builders faced challenges that tested every skill they had learned in the mountains. Here they had to work with living walls of vegetation that grew with such vigor that a path cleared in the morning might be overgrown by evening. They learned to work with the forest rather than against it, creating pathways that wound through the trees like water, finding its way to the sea, building bridges that seemed to float among the branches like dreams made manifest. The bridges were perhaps the most magical of all the Empire's creations, structures that seemed to defy not just gravity, but logic itself. The most famous spanned the Great Gorge at Apurimac, where the river carved a canyon so deep that the water far below looked like a silver thread. The bridge was woven from cables as thick as a man's waist, each strand twisted from fibers that had been blessed by priests and treated with substances that made them stronger than iron. To cross such a bridge was to experience a kind of flight, to feel the structure sway gently in the wind while remaining as solid as the mountains themselves. The builders understood that they were not just creating a means of passage, but a spiritual experience, a moment when travelers could understand their place in the vast web of connections that held the Empire together. The knowledge required to build and maintain these roads was passed down through generations of specialists who understood that they were not just craftsmen, but guardians of the Empire's lifeline. They learned to read the signs of wear and weather, to anticipate problems before they became disasters, to maintain the delicate balance between human ambition and natural forces that kept the whole system functioning. The roads carried more than just people and goods. They carried ideas, innovations, and the subtle influences that transformed local cultures into components of a greater whole. A technique for working metal that had been developed in one valley would travel along the roads to distant provinces, where it would be adapted and improved before traveling on to places where it would be transformed again. The roads were not just pathways, but laboratories, spaces where the Empire's greatest resource, its people, could meet, learn from each other, and create something greater than any single community could achieve alone. The young people who traveled these roads returned to their home villages, changed by the experience, carrying with them not just stories of distant places, but an understanding of their place in a larger pattern. They had walked paths that connected the snow-capped peaks to the jungle valleys, that bound the desert to the sea, that made the vast expanse of the Andes feel like a single, living entity. As the sun set each evening on roads that stretched farther than any empire had ever built, The people understood that they had created something unprecedented. They had not just conquered space, but transformed it, turning the barriers that had once separated peoples into bridges that connected them. The whispers of the llama paths had become the songs of an empire, and the songs had become a symphony that would echo through the mountains long after the last road builder had returned to the earth from which the stones had been taken. The children of Inti. In the high city, where the air itself seemed to shimmer with divine presence, the children of the royal bloodline grew up understanding that they were not quite human, not quite gods, but something precious balanced between earth and sky. They were the children of Inti, the sun god's own descendants, and their lives unfolded like ceremonies performed in honor of the light that gave life to all things. The royal palace was not a single building, but a complex of structures that seemed to grow from the mountainside like flowers blooming in stone. The walls were lined with sheets of gold so thin they trembled in the slightest breeze, creating patterns of light that danced across the floors like captured sunbeams. The children who played in these halls learned to read the moods of the divine in the way the light shifted throughout the day, understanding that they were living inside a prayer made manifest. Princess Kori Oklo learned to walk on floors that reflected the sky, her tiny feet making no sound on stones that had been polished to mirror brightness. She was taught that each step was a dance, each movement a form of worship, each breath a gift from the Father who lived in the heavens and watched over his children with eyes that never closed. Her nurses spoke to her in whispers that seemed to carry the weight of eternity, their words chosen with the care of people who understood that they were helping to shape a mind that would one day help shape the world. The prince, Tupac Inca, grew up in gardens where every plant had been chosen not just for beauty but for meaning. The flowers that bloomed in careful patterns told stories of the seasons, of the relationship between rain and sun, of the endless cycle of growth and rest that governed all life. He learned to read these stories before he could speak, his young mind absorbing the complex symbolism that surrounded him like air itself. The royal children were educated not by single teachers, but by councils of the wisest men and women from across the empire. Each day brought new lessons, new perspectives, new ways of understanding their place in the vast web of relationships that connected all things. They learned mathematics through the contemplation of quipu, the knotted strings that recorded everything from tax records to poetry, their fingers growing skilled at reading the language of knots and spaces, of colors and textures that carried meaning more complex than any written word. But they learned more than just practical skills. They learned to listen to the voice of the wind as it moved through the valleys, to read the messages that the clouds wrote across the sky, to understand the conversations that the rivers held with the sea. They were taught that knowledge wasn't something to be hoarded, but something to be shared, that wisdom grew not through accumulation, but through synthesis, through the ability to see connections that others missed. The princess learned to weave not just with thread, but with understanding, her tapestries capturing not just images, but emotions, not just scenes, but the essence of the places and people they depicted. Her teachers, master weavers who had learned their craft from mothers who had learned from grandmothers in an unbroken chain stretching back to the 1800 beginning of time, guided her hands as she worked with fibers that had been blessed by priests and dyed with colors that seemed to hold light within themselves. Each textile she created was a meditation, a prayer worked into the fabric of reality itself. The patterns she chose were not arbitrary, but followed rules that had been established by the gods themselves, geometric designs that reflected the order of the universe, the relationship between the movements of the stars and the changing of the seasons. To wear such a garment was to be clothed in divine protection, to carry the blessing of the sun god in the very threads that touched the skin. The prince learned to speak not just to people, but to the land itself, to understand the language of the mountains and the moods of the weather. His teachers took him to places where the air was so thin that ordinary men would struggle to breathe, where the silence was so complete that he could hear the beating of his own heart. In these high places he learned to listen with more than his ears, to sense the presence of the spirits that lived in the peaks and valleys, to understand that he was part of a conversation that had been going on since the world began. The royal children were taught that their privileges came with responsibilities that extended beyond their own lives, beyond their own empire, beyond their own time. They were guardians of knowledge that must be preserved, protectors of traditions that must be maintained, bridges between the human world and the divine, forces that governed existence. Their education was not just about learning facts, but about developing the wisdom to use those facts in service of something greater than themselves. The festivals that marked the royal calendar were not just celebrations, but learning experiences, opportunities for the children to understand their place in the cosmic order. During Inti Raymi, the great festival of the sun, they learned to read the shadow patterns that told the story of the year, to understand the relationship between the movement of the heavens and the rhythm of life on earth. They participated in ceremonies that connected them to their ancestors, to the long line of rulers who had come before them, and the generations who would come after. The princess learned to dance in patterns that mirrored the movement of the stars, her feet tracing paths across the ceremonial plazas that told stories of creation, of the endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth that governed all existence. Her costumes were works of art that took months to create, each feather and bead chosen for its significance, each color carrying meaning that had been established by generations of tradition. The prince learned to lead not through commands, but through example, to understand that true authority came not from position, but from the willingness to serve, to sacrifice, to put the needs of the people before personal desires. He was taught that the crown was not a symbol of power, but of responsibility, that each decision he would make as ruler would affect not just his own life, but the lives of millions of people who looked to him for guidance and protection. The royal children grew up surrounded by beauty that was not just decorative, but instructive, art that taught them about the nature of reality itself. The murals that covered the palace walls depicted not just historical events, but the principles that governed the universe, the relationships between gods and mortals, the consequences of decisions made in harmony with divine will and those made in opposition to it. They learned to appreciate not just the beauty of the objects that surrounded them, but the skill and devotion of the people who had created them. The golden vessels from which they ate were not just containers, but prayers made manifest, shaped by craftsmen who understood that they were working with the substance of the sun itself, that each curve and line was a form of worship offered to the God who gave life to all things. The music that filled the palace was not just entertainment, but education, songs that carried the history of the empire, the wisdom of the ancestors, the hopes and dreams of the people. The royal children learned to play instruments that had been carved from wood that had been blessed by priests, to sing in harmonies that reflected the music of the spheres, to understand that sound itself was a form of prayer, a way of communicating with the divine forces that governed existence. As they grew older, the royal children began to understand that their education wasn't just about preparing them for roles they would play in the future, but about making them worthy of the trust that had been placed in them. They were being shaped, not just as individuals, but as symbols, representatives of the divine order that their father embodied, guardians of the traditions that held the empire together. The princess learned to read the quipu not just as records, but as poetry, to understand the way that numbers and colors and textures could be woven together to create meaning that went beyond the simple recording of facts. She discovered that the knotted strings held not just information about tax collections and population counts, but songs, stories and prayers that had been preserved in a form that would endure long after the voices that had first spoken them had fallen silent. The prince learned to see the empire not as a collection of provinces, but as a living organism, each region a vital organ with its own function, its own needs, its own contribution to the health of the whole. He understood that ruling meant not just making decisions, but understanding the consequences of those decisions, seeing how changes in one part of the empire would ripple out to affect all the others. The royal children were raised to understand that they were not just the inheritors of power, but the guardians of a vision, the keepers of a dream that had transformed scattered mountain villages into the greatest empire the world had ever known. Their lives were not their own, but belonged to the people they would one day serve, to the traditions they would preserve, to the future they would help create. As the sun set each evening on the golden city, painting the walls with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself, the children of Inti prepared for sleep, knowing that they were part of something larger than themselves, something that connected them to the stars that wheeled overhead and the earth that supported their feet. They were the bridge between heaven and earth, the living symbols of a civilization that had learned to live in harmony with the divine forces that governed all existence, cities among the clouds. High in the Andes, where the air grew thin and the world seemed to touch the sky, the master builders of the empire began to dream cities into existence. These were not mere settlements, but prayers carved in stone. Places where human vision and divine inspiration merged to create something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of architecture and entered the realm of the sacred. Machu Picchu emerged from the mountain peak like a flower blooming from living rock, its terraces cascading down the slopes in perfect harmony with the natural contours of the mountain. The builders who worked on this sacred city understood that they were not imposing human will upon the landscape, but discovering the city that had always been waiting within the stone, waiting for hands skilled enough to reveal its hidden beauty. The location itself had been chosen through dreams and divination, through the patient observation of how the light moved across the peaks throughout the seasons, how the clouds gathered and dispersed, how the ancient spirits of the place made their presence known to those who knew how to listen. The high priest who first walked these slopes had felt the mountain's approval like a warmth spreading through his chest, a recognition that this place was meant for something extraordinary. The builders worked with reverence that bordered on worship, understanding that every stone they placed was a word in a conversation with the divine. They began each day with ceremonies that honored the spirits of the place, asking permission to reshape the mountain in service of the sun god, offering prayers that rose with the morning mist and disappeared into the endless blue of the high-altitude sky. The city that grew from their labor was unlike anything that had been built before. It seemed to float among the clouds, its stone walls catching and reflecting the light in ways that made the entire complex shimmer like a mirage. The buildings were not separate structures, but parts of a single living organism, connected by pathways that flowed like water, by sight lines that guided the eye toward views that took the breath away, by acoustic properties that carried whispers from one end of the city to the other. The Temple of the Sun stood at the heart of the complex, its curved walls following the natural bedrock with such precision that it was impossible to tell where the mountain ended and the human construction began. The windows were positioned to frame the rising sun on the winter solstice, creating a moment when the entire chamber would fill with golden light, so pure it seemed to transform the air itself into something sacred. But the temple was not just a building, but an instrument designed to amplify the relationship between the human and divine. The priests who served there understood that they were not just performing rituals, but participating in a cosmic conversation, their chants echoing off the perfectly tuned walls in harmonies that seemed to call down the very presence of the gods. The residential areas of the city were arranged according to principles that honored both practical needs and spiritual requirements. The houses of the nobility were positioned to catch the morning sun, their doorways oriented toward the sacred peaks that surrounded the city like sleeping giants. The common quarters were designed with equal care, understanding that every person who lived in this place was part of the sacred community, that their comfort and happiness was essential to the spiritual health of the whole. The water systems that supplied the city were marvels of engineering that seemed to defy the laws of physics. Springs that emerged from the living rock were channeled through carved channels that guided the water in patterns that seemed to dance, creating fountains that sang with different notes depending on the season and the time of day. The sound of running water was constant throughout the city, a liquid music that reminded the inhabitants that they were surrounded by life, that even in this high place where the air was thin and the nights were cold, the earth still pulsed with vitality. The agricultural terraces that surrounded the city were not just farming plots, but expressions of artistic vision, their curves following the natural contours of the mountain in ways that enhanced rather than violated the landscape's inherent beauty. The farmers who worked these terraces understood that they were not just growing food, but creating a living tapestry, their crops planted in patterns that changed with the seasons, creating a landscape that was never the same from one month to the next. The varieties of crops grown in these high places were marvels of adaptation, plants that had been bred over generations to thrive in conditions that would kill their lowland cousins. The potatoes that grew in the highest terraces were small but intensely flavored, their flesh dense with nutrients that had been concentrated by the harsh conditions. The quinoa that rippled in the mountain winds was a grain that seemed to capture the essence of the highlands themselves, its seeds carrying the memory of snow and sun, of thin air and endless sky. Ollantaytambo, another of the great mountain cities, was built in a valley that seemed to have been carved by the gods as a perfect amphitheater. The city rose from the valley floor in tiers that followed the natural geology, each level connected to the others by staircases that seemed to climb directly toward the stars. The builders who worked on this city understood that they were creating not just a place to live, but a stage for the great drama of human existence, a setting where the daily activities of life would take on the character of ritual. The fortress that crowned the city was a masterpiece of defensive architecture that seemed to grow from the very bones of the mountain. The walls were built from stones so massive that later generations would wonder how they had been quarried, transported, and fitted together with such precision. But the builders knew secrets that had been passed down through generations of stoneworkers, techniques for reading the grain of the rock, for finding the natural breaking points, for moving blocks that weighed more than a dozen men could lift. The most remarkable feature of Ollantaytambo was the Wall of the Six Monoliths, a structure that seemed to defy not just engineering, but imagination itself. 6 enormous blocks of pink granite had been fitted together so perfectly that they seemed to have been carved from a single piece of stone, their surfaces polished to a mirror finish that reflected the sky with such clarity that birds sometimes flew into them, mistaking the reflection for open air. The quarry from which these stones had been taken lay across the valley, a distance that would have challenged modern equipment. Yet the builders had managed to transport them across the river, up the steep slopes, and into their final positions, using techniques that involved not just engineering, but a deep understanding of the relationship between human will and natural forces. They had worked with the mountain rather than against it, finding ways to make the stone cooperate in its own transformation. Pisac, built on a series of terraces that seemed to cascade down the mountainside like frozen waterfalls, was a city that celebrated the relationship between human ingenuity and natural beauty. The buildings were positioned to take advantage of every nuance of the mountain's geography, their windows framing views that changed throughout the day as the light moved across the peaks and valleys below. The market squares of Pisac were designed as gathering places where people from across the region could come to trade not just goods, but ideas, stories, and the subtle influences that kept the empire's culture alive and growing. The acoustics of these spaces were carefully planned so that a speaker standing in the center could be heard clearly by hundreds of people, their voice carrying to every corner without the need for shouting or strain. The burial grounds that surrounded the city were carved directly into the cliff faces, creating a necropolis that seemed to merge with the living rock. The architects who designed these eternal resting places understood that death was not an ending, but a transformation, that the spirits of the deceased needed to remain connected to the community of the living. The tombs were positioned to catch the first light of dawn, ensuring that the ancestors would be awakened each morning by the touch of their divine father. Each of these cities was unique, reflecting the personality of its mountain, its climate, its relationship with the sky. Yet they were all connected by the same principles, the same understanding of the relationship between human needs and divine will, the same commitment to creating spaces that would enhance rather than diminish the natural beauty of the places where they were built. The builders who created these marvels were not just skilled craftsmen, but artists whose medium was stone and whose inspiration came from the gods themselves. They understood that they were working not just for the present, but for eternity. That the cities they built would outlast the empire that commissioned them, would continue to stand long after the last Inca had returned to the earth. The young people who grew up in these cities among the clouds developed a relationship with altitude and thin air that was almost supernatural. They learned to read the weather patterns that swept across the peaks, to understand the language of the wind and the messages that the clouds wrote across the sky. They played games that would have been impossible at lower elevations, their laughter echoing off the stone walls and disappearing into the endless blue of the mountain sky. The festivals that were celebrated in these high places took on a character that was both earthly and divine, ceremonies that seemed to bridge the gap between the human and divine worlds. The dances that were performed on the ceremonial plazas seemed to make the dancers float above the ground, their movements so perfectly coordinated with the rhythm of the mountains that they appeared to be part of the landscape itself. The music that filled these cities was unlike anything that could be created at lower elevations, compositions that took advantage of the unique acoustic properties of the thin air and the stone architecture. The flutes and drums that provided the soundtrack for daily life seemed to speak directly to the soul, their melodies carrying messages that went beyond words, beyond thoughts, directly to the heart of what it meant to be human, in a world where the divine was always present, always watching, always blessing those who lived in harmony with its will. As the sun set each evening on these cities among the clouds, painting the stone walls with light that seemed to come from within the mountains themselves, the inhabitants understood that they were living in places that were not just settlements, but sanctuaries, not just homes, but temples, not just cities, but prayers carved in stone and offered to the sky. They were the children of the heights, the people who had learned to live where the earth touched the heavens, and their cities would stand as monuments to human vision and divine inspiration long after the empire that built them had faded into legend. Gold and the gods. In the heart of the sacred valley, where the morning mist rose from the rivers like prayers ascending to heaven, the smiths who worked with gold understood that they were not merely craftsmen, but priests, their hammers tools of devotion, their forges altars where the substance of the sun itself was transformed into objects of divine beauty. The gold that flowed through their hands was not just metal, but liquid light, the very essence of Inti made manifest in the physical world. The workshops where they labored were more than places of production. They were temples where the boundaries between the sacred and the practical dissolved like morning frost touched by the first rays of dawn. The walls were lined with sheets of the precious metal, polished to such perfection that they seemed to glow with their own inner fire, creating an environment where the smiths worked surrounded by the presence of the divine. The master goldsmith, Chaska, had learned his craft from his father, who had learned from his father before him, in an unbroken chain of knowledge that stretched back to the first people who had discovered that certain stones, when heated in the right way, would release the substance that the gods had hidden within them. His hands moved with the certainty of generations of practice, each gesture a prayer, each strike of the hammer a word in the ancient conversation between human skill and divine inspiration. The gold itself came from streams that ran down from the highest peaks, where the mountain spirits had concentrated the essence of the sun in veins that ran through the living rock like golden blood. The miners who extracted it understood that they were not taking, but receiving, that each nugget was a gift from the gods that must be accepted with gratitude and used with reverence. The process of purification was itself a ceremony, the metal heated in furnaces that burned with fires that never died, tended by priests who understood that they were not just maintaining flames, but keeping alive the sacred connection between the earth and the sky. The smoke that rose from these furnaces carried prayers to the heavens, messages of thanks and requests for continued blessing, for the wisdom to use the gifts of the gods in ways that would honor their generosity. The objects that emerged from these workshops were not just decorative, but functional, not just beautiful, but meaningful. The golden vessels from which the royal family drank were shaped to enhance the flavors of the chicha and the ceremonial beverages, their surfaces decorated with patterns that told stories of the relationship between the gods and their children. To drink from such a vessel was to participate in a communion that connected the drinker to the divine forces that governed all existence. The jewelry that adorned the nobility was more than ornamentation. It was a form of communication, a way of displaying not just wealth, but spiritual authority, not just power, but responsibility. Each piece was crafted according to principles that had been established by the gods themselves, designs that incorporated symbols of cosmic significance, patterns that reflected the movement of the stars and the changing of the seasons. The princess wore earrings that caught the light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to move with a life of their own. Their surfaces worked with such skill that they appeared to be made not of metal, but of captured sunlight. The weight of them reminded her constantly of her connection to the divine, of the responsibility that came with being a child of the sun god, of the need to live in a way that honored the gifts that had been given to her. The prince's ceremonial crown was a masterpiece that had taken months to complete, its surface covered with figures that seemed to dance in the flickering light of the torches. The goldsmith who created it had fasted for days before beginning work, purifying himself through prayer and meditation until he felt the presence of the gods guiding his hands. Each element of the design had been chosen for its spiritual significance, creating a work of art that was also a sacred object, a physical manifestation of the divine authority that flowed through the royal bloodline. But the most magnificent of all the golden objects was the great disk that hung in the temple of the sun, a circle of metal so pure that it seemed to be made of crystallized light itself. The surface was worked with images that told the story of creation, of the emergence of the gods from the primordial waters, of the gift of life to the first humans, of the establishment of the divine order that governed all existence. To look upon it was to understand one's place in the cosmic hierarchy, to feel the presence of the gods as a tangible force that surrounded and supported all life. The disk was not just a work of art, but an instrument of worship, designed to catch and reflect the light of the sun in ways that would create specific effects at different times of the day and year. During the solstice ceremonies, when the sun reached its highest point in the sky, the disk would blaze with such intensity that it seemed to become a second sun, filling the temple with light so pure that those who witnessed it felt themselves transported to the very presence of the divine. The gardens that surrounded the temple were filled with golden flowers that never wilted, leaves that never fell, fruits that never rotted. These artificial plants were so perfectly crafted that they seemed more real than the living vegetation, their surfaces catching the light in ways that made them appear to move in breezes that existed only in the realm of the spirit. The garden was a representation of the eternal spring that existed in the realm of the gods, a place where the seasons never changed and the beauty never faded. The golden llamas that grazed in these eternal pastures were works of art that seemed to breathe with life, their poses so natural that visitors often expected them to move, to turn their heads, or flick their tails. The craftsmen who created them had studied the animals with the devotion of naturalists, understanding that to capture their essence in metal required not just skill, but love, not just technique, but empathy. The storehouse that contained the empire's reserves of gold was more than a treasury. It was a sacred space where the accumulated wealth of generations was kept not for display, but for use in the service of the gods. The gold was not hoarded, but circulated, flowing through the empire like blood through a body, always returning to the center to be purified and redistributed according to the needs of the people and the requirements of the divine. The accounting system that tracked this flow was itself a marvel of organization, managed by specialists who understood that they were not just keeping records, but maintaining the balance that kept the empire functioning. The quipu they used to record the movements of gold were works of art in themselves, their colors and patterns creating a language that could express not just quantities, but qualities, not just numbers, but the subtle relationships that connected all things. The festivals that celebrated the empire's relationship with gold were spectacular displays of artistic skill and spiritual devotion. The participants wore costumes that seemed to be made of sunlight itself, their movements creating patterns of light that danced across the ceremonial plazas like living flames. The music that accompanied these celebrations was played on instruments that had been crafted from the precious metal, their tones pure and clear as mountain air, their melodies carrying messages that went beyond words. The priests who officiated at these ceremonies understood that they were not just performing rituals, but facilitating communication between the human and divine worlds. The gold that surrounded them wasn't just decoration, but a medium through which the gods made their presence known, a substance that bridged the gap between the physical and spiritual realms. The children who grew up in this environment of golden splendor learned to see the precious metal not as a symbol of wealth, but as a reminder of their connection to the divine. They understood that the gold that surrounded them was not theirs to possess, but theirs to protect, not theirs to hoard, but theirs to share, not theirs to worship, but theirs to use in service of the gods who had given it to them. The artisans who worked with gold passed their knowledge down through generations, each master teaching his apprentices not just the techniques of the craft, but the spiritual principles that governed its use. They understood that they were not just creating objects, but participating in the ongoing act of creation, that their work was a form of prayer that connected them to the divine forces that had shaped the world. The traders who carried golden objects to the farthest reaches of the empire understood that they were not just merchants, but ambassadors, carrying with them not just goods, but the presence of the gods themselves. The objects they transported were imbued with the spiritual power of the places where they had been created, carrying blessings and protection to the people who would eventually own them. The workshops where gold was worked rang with the sound of hammers that beat out rhythms that seemed to match the heartbeat of the earth itself. The apprentices who learned their craft in these sacred spaces understood that they were not just acquiring skills, but joining a brotherhood that stretched back to the beginning of time, that connected them to the gods who had first taught humans the secrets of working with the substance of the sun. As the light faded each evening and the workshops fell silent, the golden objects that had been created that day seemed to glow with their own inner fire, as if they had absorbed some of the divine essence that had guided their creation. The smiths who had made them understood that they had participated in something sacred, that their work would outlast their lives, that they had contributed to the ongoing conversation between humanity and the divine. That was the true purpose of all their labor. The gold flowed through the empire like a river of light, connecting the highest peaks to the deepest valleys, the most remote provinces to the heart of the sacred city. It was not just a metal, but a medium, Not just a substance, but a symbol. Not just wealth, but a reminder of the divine presence that surrounded and supported all life. In the hands of the skilled artisans who knew its secrets, it became more than gold. It became a bridge between the world of men and the realm of the gods, a substance that carried within it the very essence of the sun that gave life to all things. The coming storm. Beyond the eastern edge of the world, where the great waters stretched toward horizons that had never known the touch of human feet, ships moved like clouds across the surface of the endless sea. These vessels carried within them men whose dreams were made of gold and whose hearts beat with the rhythm of conquest, strangers who had sailed from lands where the sun rose cold, and the gods spoke in languages that had no words for harmony. The seers in the high temples had been dreaming of these strangers for months, their visions filled with images that made no sense in the context of the world they knew. They saw men whose skin was the color of storm clouds, whose faces were covered with hair like the pelts of animals, whose bodies were wrapped in metal that gleamed like water but rang like stone when struck. They saw creatures that were like llamas but larger, with flowing manes and eyes that held intelligence but not wisdom. Beasts that could carry men on their backs as if they were bags of grain. The high priest of the Temple of the Sun woke each morning with the taste of these visions bitter in his mouth, his dreams filled with omens that spoke of change coming like an avalanche, inevitable and destructive. He cast the sacred bones again and again, seeking clarity in the patterns they made when they fell, but the messages they carried were clouded with confusion, as if the gods themselves were uncertain about what was approaching. The emperor, Huayna Capac, felt the weight of these prophecies like a stone in his chest. He had ruled for decades with the wisdom of a man who understood that power was not about commanding, but about listening, about reading the subtle signs that warned of danger before it became visible to ordinary eyes. But the signs he was reading now spoke of something unprecedented, something that lay beyond the boundaries of the known world and the familiar patterns of threat and response. The empire itself seemed to sense the approaching change. The weather patterns that had been reliable for generations began to shift in ways that made the farmers nervous and the priests uneasy. Rains came when they should have been absent. Droughts struck when the valleys should have been green with growth. The very earth seemed to tremble with anticipation, as if the mountains themselves were preparing for something that would test their eternal patience. In the coastal provinces, where the empire touched the great waters, strange objects began to wash up on the beaches. Pieces of wood that had been shaped by tools that left marks unlike any the local craftsman had ever seen. Fragments of metal that had been forged using techniques that produced alloys unknown to the imperial smiths. Most disturbing of all, pieces of cloth woven from fibers that seemed to come from no plant or animal that existed in the known world. The local governors sent reports to the capital, their messages carried by the fastest chasqui runners, their words chosen with the care of men who understood that they were describing something that might be impossible. The emperor read these reports with growing unease. His advisers gathered around him like shadows in the golden halls of the palace, their faces reflecting the same uncertainty that he felt growing in his own heart. The prince, Atahualpa had grown into a man whose strength was matched only by his intelligence, whose courage was tempered by the wisdom that came from understanding the weight of responsibility. He had led armies in the northern provinces, where the empire's borders pressed against peoples who had never accepted for rule of the sun god, and he had learned that victory came not from strength alone, but from the ability to adapt, to respond to the unexpected with strategies that had never been tested. But the reports that reached him from the coast spoke of something that lay beyond the realm of normal warfare, beyond the familiar patterns of siege and diplomacy that had served the empire for generations. The strangers who were approaching seemed to possess weapons that could kill at distances, that made traditional tactics useless, that could breach walls that had been built to withstand any assault that the known world could mount. The princess, Koya, spent her days in the Temple of the Moon, seeking guidance from the goddess who watched over the empire during the dark hours when the sun god rested. Her prayers rose like incense in the cool air of the sanctuary, her voice carrying requests for wisdom, for protection, for the strength to face whatever was coming with the dignity that befitted a daughter of the divine bloodline. The dreams that came to her in the sacred chambers were filled with images of transformation, of the world she knew dissolving like morning mist and being replaced by something that bore no resemblance to the order that had governed her life. She saw cities burning with fires that consumed stone as easily as wood, saw roads that had taken generations to build crumbling as if they had been made of sand, saw the golden sun disk of the temple melting like wax in the heat of some unimaginable flame. The craftsmen who worked in the imperial workshops began to report difficulties that had never been experienced before. The gold seemed reluctant to flow. The silver appeared clouded, even after the most thorough purification. The bronze rang with notes that sounded wrong to ears that had been trained to recognize the true voice of properly worked metal. It was as if the very materials were responding to the approaching change, as if the substances that had been blessed by the gods were preparing to withdraw their cooperation. The farmers in the highland valleys noticed that their crops were growing in patterns that made no sense according to the accumulated wisdom of generations. Plants that should have thrived in the high altitudes were failing, while others that had never been seen at such elevations were appearing spontaneously in fields that had been planted with entirely different seeds. The animals, too, seemed nervous, the llamas gathering in groups that faced toward the sea, their eyes fixed on horizons that held no visible threat. The Quipu readers who maintained the empire's vast network of information began to discover knots in their record strings that they had not tied, patterns that seemed to have appeared overnight in systems that had been checked and verified the day before. The colors of the strings were changing, fading in some places, becoming more vivid in others, as if the very medium through which knowledge was stored was responding to forces that lay beyond human understanding. The emperor called councils that stretched long into the night, bringing together the wisest men and women from across the empire, seeking in their collective wisdom some strategy for dealing with a threat that seemed to defy all the categories through which danger had previously been understood. but even the most learned of his advisers could offer nothing but speculation, their knowledge vast in the realm of the known, but useless in the face of something that had no precedent in the experience of their people. The runners who carried messages between the coastal provinces and the capital began to report encounters with survivors of shipwrecks, men who spoke in languages that had no relationship to any of the tongues known within the empire. These strangers carried with them objects that seemed to be made of the same strange materials that had been washing up on the beaches, tools whose purpose was unclear, but whose craftsmanship suggested a level of skill that was both impressive and troubling. The few survivors who had learned enough Quechua to communicate told stories that seemed to come from the realm of fever dreams rather than actual experience. They spoke of lands across the great waters, where the sun was weak and the air was thick, where men lived in structures made of stone that reached towards the sky like artificial mountains, where weapons existed that could kill with the speed of lightning and the force of thunder. The priests who questioned these strangers found their accounts difficult to believe, filled as they were with descriptions of technologies that seemed to violate the natural order, of societies that appeared to be organized around principles that had nothing to do with the harmony that the empire had spent centuries perfecting. Yet the physical evidence that accompanied these stories, the metal objects, the strange textiles, the substances that seemed to come from plants and animals that existed nowhere in the known world, suggested that however impossible the accounts might sound, they were based on some form of reality. The emperor began to experience dreams that were more vivid than his waking life, visions that showed him the empire as it might appear to eyes that had never seen it before. He saw the Golden City not as the center of a divine order, but as a collection of buildings that could be conquered, the roads not as sacred connections, but as pathways that could be used by enemies, the people not as children of the sun god, but as obstacles to be overcome, or resources to be exploited. The vision filled him with a sadness that was deeper than any emotion he had ever experienced, a grief that seemed to encompass not just his own fate, but the fate of everything he had spent his life protecting. He understood, with the clarity that comes to those who have been chosen by the gods for great responsibilities, that the world he had known was ending, that the storm that was approaching would leave nothing unchanged, that the empire he had inherited from his fathers would not be the empire he would leave to his sons. The final reports from the coastal provinces spoke of ships that had been sighted on the horizon, vessels larger than any that had ever been built in the known world, their sails white as snow against the blue of the infinite sea. The watchers who observed them from the cliff tops reported that they seemed to be moving against the wind, driven by forces that had nothing to do with the patterns of air and water that governed the movement of all other vessels. As the sun set on what would be the last night of the old world, the emperor stood on the highest terrace of his palace, looking out over the valley that had been the heart of his empire for generations. The golden walls caught the dying light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to write messages across the sky, final communications from the gods to their children, blessings and farewells combined in the ancient language of light and shadow. The storm was coming, and there was nothing that could be done to turn it aside. The only choice that remained was how to meet it, how to face the end of the world with the dignity that had defined the empire since its birth, how to ensure that something of what had been built would survive the destruction that was about to begin. Stranger at the gates. The morning when the world changed forever began like any other in the coastal city of Tumbes, where the desert met the sea, and the fishermen cast their nets into waters that reflected the pale light of dawn. But as the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the watchers on the cliffs began to see shapes on the horizon that made them rub their eyes and look again, wondering if the thin air of the heights was playing tricks with their vision. The shapes resolved themselves into vessels unlike any that had ever been seen in these waters, great structures that seemed to float on the surface of the sea, like islands that had broken free from the earth. Their sides were the color of weathered wood, rising from the water in curves that suggested they had been carved from single enormous trees, though no trees of such size had ever grown in the known world. From their tops rose towers of white that caught the wind and seemed to draw power from the air itself, driving the vessels forward with a purpose that was both beautiful and terrifying. Francisco Pizarro stood on the deck of the largest vessel, his eyes fixed on the coastline that was growing larger with each passing moment. He was a man shaped by years of hardship and ambition, his face weathered by sun and salt water, his hands scarred by the tools of war and exploration. But it was his eyes that revealed the true nature of what he had become. Dark pools that reflected not the beauty of the world around him, but the hunger that drove him across an ocean toward a destiny that would transform both his life and the lives of countless others. Behind him, 168 men prepared for a landing that would mark the beginning of the end of the greatest empire the Americas had ever known. They were soldiers and adventurers, craftsmen and criminals, men who had left behind the familiar world of their birth to seek fortune in lands that existed only in the stories told by sailors and the dreams of those who believed that gold could be found in quantities that would make them rich beyond imagination. The armor they wore was made of metal that had been forged in workshops where the techniques had been perfected over centuries of constant warfare. The steel plates that covered their bodies rang like bells when struck, their surfaces polished to mirror brightness that threw back the light of the sun in patterns that seemed to dance with their movements. The weapons they carried were products of a technology that the peoples of the New World had never encountered. Swords and spears and crossbows that could kill with an efficiency that would have been impossible using the tools available to their victims. But perhaps the most devastating weapons they carried were invisible. The diseases that their bodies harbored, sicknesses that were as common as breathing in the world they had left behind, but would prove to be more deadly than any sword or spear in the world they were about to enter. The smallpox and measles and typhus that lived in their blood would spread through the empire like fire through dry grass, killing more people than all the battles that would be fought in the years to come. The first contact between the two worlds took place on the beach at Tumbes, where the local inhabitants had gathered to watch the arrival of the strange vessels. The Inca officials who governed the city approached the landing boats with the mixture of curiosity and caution that had served their people well in centuries of dealing with unfamiliar situations. They brought gifts of gold and silver, textiles that had been woven with skills that took generations to master, and food that had been prepared according to recipes that honored the gods who had blessed the harvest. The Spanish explorers who waded ashore through the surf saw not an expression of hospitality, but a display of wealth that exceeded their wildest dreams. The golden ornaments that adorned the officials glittered in the sunlight like captured stars. Their surfaces worked with such skill that they seemed to move with a life of their own. The textiles that were offered as gifts were works of art that would have been treasured in any court in Europe, their patterns and colors creating visual symphonies that spoke of a level of artistic achievement that the strangers had never encountered. But the cultural gap that separated the two groups was wider than the ocean that the Spanish had crossed to reach this place. The Inca officials saw the strangers as possible messengers from the gods, their pale skin and strange clothing marking them as beings who might have come from the realm of the divine. The Spanish saw the natives as obstacles to be overcome or resources to be exploited, their wealth and apparent vulnerability making them perfect targets for the kind of conquest that had already been practiced on other islands and coastlines. The interpreter who tried to bridge the gap between the two languages struggled with concepts that had no equivalent in either tongue. How could he explain to the Inca officials that the strangers saw their gold not as a sacred substance, but as a medium of exchange, that their textiles were valued not for their spiritual significance, but for their market price, that their food was appreciated not as communion with the divine, but as fuel for bodies that had been weakened by months at sea? The first formal meeting between the representatives of the two civilizations took place in the plaza of Tumbes, where the Spanish explorers were received with a ceremony that had been designed to honor visitors who might be divine messengers. The local officials wore their finest garments, their bodies adorned with jewelry that had been passed down through generations of careful stewardship. The music that accompanied the ceremony was played on instruments that had been crafted with the same devotion that went into the creation of religious objects, their tones pure and clear as mountain air. The Spanish adventurers watched the proceedings with eyes that saw not spiritual significance, but tactical opportunity. They noted the quality of the weapons carried by the Inca guards, the layout of the city's defenses, the apparent wealth of the population, and the absence of the kinds of fortifications that would have been necessary to defend against European methods of warfare. They saw a civilization that was rich and sophisticated, but apparently unprepared for the kind of conflict that was about to engulf it. The gifts that were exchanged during this first meeting carried meanings that neither side fully understood. The Spanish offered manufactured goods from their homeland, metal tools that had been produced in quantities that would have been impossible using Inca techniques, textiles that had been woven on mechanical looms that could produce cloth faster than any human hands, and glass objects that seemed to capture and transform light in ways that appeared almost magical to eyes that had never seen such materials. The Inca officials responded with gifts that represented the highest achievements of their civilization. Golden vessels that had been shaped by craftsmen who understood that they were working with the substance of the sun itself. Textiles that had been woven by artists who knew that their work would outlast their lives, and food that had been prepared with ingredients that had been blessed by priests who understood the sacred nature of nourishment. But beneath the surface politeness of these exchanges, both sides were gathering intelligence that should be used in the conflicts that were already beginning to seem inevitable. The Spanish were learning about the political structure of the empire, the location of its wealth, the nature of its defenses, and the religious beliefs that might be exploited to their advantage. The Inca were trying to understand the intentions of the strangers, the source of their power, and the threat they might pose to the order that had governed their world for generations. The reports that were sent back to the capital city of Cusco carried descriptions that strained the limits of language, words struggling to convey experiences that had no precedent in the history of the empire. The chasqui runners who carried these messages ran with unusual urgency, understanding that they were carrying news that would transform the world of everyone who heard it. Their feet pounded out rhythms on the ancient roads that seemed to echo with the heartbeat of a world that was already beginning to change. The Emperor Atahualpa, who had recently emerged victorious from a civil war that had divided the empire between himself and his brother Huascar, received these reports with the wariness of a man who had learned that threats could come from unexpected directions. The war that had just ended had tested his understanding of strategy and politics, teaching him that even the most carefully laid plans could be disrupted by forces that had not been anticipated. But the reports from the coast spoke of something that lay beyond the realm of familiar conflict, something that challenged not just his military skills, but his understanding of the nature of reality itself. The Spanish explorers, meanwhile, had established a base camp on the coast and were sending out parties to explore the interior of the country, their movements tracked by Inca scouts who reported back on every aspect of their behavior. The strangers seemed to be particularly interested in gold, their eyes lighting up with an intensity that was almost frightening whenever they encountered objects made from the precious metal. They asked questions about the sources of the gold, the methods used to work it, and the quantities that might be available, their inquiries carrying an urgency that suggested this was more than mere curiosity. The horses that the Spanish had brought with them were perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their presence, creatures that seemed to combine the strength of men with the speed of the wind and the intelligence of beings that might have been touched by divine power. The Inca had never seen animals that could carry humans on their backs while moving faster than any person could run, and the sight of mounted Spanish soldiers created a psychological impact that was almost as devastating as their physical capabilities. The steel weapons and armor that the Spanish possessed represented a level of technological sophistication that the Inca had never encountered. The swords that the strangers carried could cut through Inca weapons and armor as if they were made of soft wood, while their own bodies remained protected by metal plates that seemed to turn aside even the most skillfully aimed blows. The crossbows they used could kill at distances that made traditional Inca tactics useless, while their arquebuses produced sounds like thunder and smoke like volcanic eruptions, creating confusion and terror among warriors who had never experienced such weapons. But perhaps the most significant advantage that the Spanish possessed was their understanding of the political situation within the empire. Through careful questioning of the people they encountered, they learned about the civil war that had recently ended, the tensions that still existed between different factions, and the resentment that some peoples felt toward the central authority of Cusco. This knowledge would prove to be more valuable than any weapon, allowing them to exploit divisions that had been created by the empire's own internal conflicts. The meeting between Atahualpa and Pizarro was arranged through a complex series of negotiations that involved diplomats and interpreters, priests and military officers, all trying to bridge the gap between two civilizations that had developed in complete isolation from each other. The emperor agreed to meet the Spanish leader in the city of Cajamarca, a location that was chosen because it was neutral ground, a place where both sides could gather without seeming to give advantage to the other. The preparations for this meeting involved thousands of people on both sides, each group making ready according to their own understanding of what the encounter might bring. The Inca prepared for a ceremony that would demonstrate the wealth and power of their empire, hoping to convince the strangers that they were dealing with a force too mighty to be challenged. They gathered the finest textiles, the most beautiful golden objects, and the most skilled performers, creating a display that was intended to overwhelm the visitors with the magnificence of Inca civilization. The Spanish prepared for what they intended to be a trap, a carefully planned ambush that would capture the emperor and decapitate the empire's leadership in a single stroke. They positioned their soldiers in hidden locations around the plaza where the meeting was to take place, their weapons ready and their horses saddled for immediate action. They understood that their small numbers made a direct confrontation impossible, but they hoped that the capture of the emperor would create enough confusion to allow them to seize control of the situation. The night before the meeting, both leaders spent hours in preparation that was as much spiritual as practical. Atahualpa prayed to the gods who had watched over his family for generations, seeking guidance from Inti and wisdom from the spirits of his ancestors. He understood that he was facing a test that would determine not just his own fate, but the future of his people, and he prepared himself with the ritual purification that had been prescribed for rulers who faced moments of supreme crisis. Pizarro spent the night checking and rechecking his plans, going over every detail of the ambush that he hoped would deliver the riches of the empire into his hands. He was a man who had spent his life taking calculated risks, but he understood that the gamble he was about to make was the largest he had ever attempted. Success would make him one of the wealthiest men in the world. Failure would likely result in his death and the death of all his followers. The dawn of the meeting day broke clear and cold over the mountains that surrounded Cajamarca, the sun painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to foretell the blood that would be shed before the day was over. The air itself seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the very atmosphere understood that it was witnessing the beginning of the end of one world and the violent birth of another. The emperor's procession toward the plaza was a masterpiece of imperial ceremony, designed to demonstrate the divine nature of Inca authority and the vast resources that the empire could command. Thousands of attendants accompanied Atahualpa, their movements choreographed with precision that turned the entire procession into a kind of religious dance. The emperor himself was carried on a litter made of gold, his body adorned with jewelry that caught the morning light and threw it back in patterns that seemed to make him glow with divine radiance. The Spanish soldiers, hidden in the buildings around the plaza, watched this display with feelings that combined awe with greed, fear with determination. They had never seen wealth displayed with such casual magnificence, had never witnessed a demonstration of power that was so completely foreign to their own understanding of how authority should be expressed. But they also saw opportunity in the very openness of the display, understanding that the Inca confidence in their own invincibility might be turned against them. The moment when the two leaders came face to face was one of those instants when history pivots on the actions of individuals, when the fate of civilizations hangs in the balance of decisions made by men who may not fully understand the consequences of their choices. Atahualpa, carried on his golden litter and surrounded by the flower of Inca nobility, faced Francisco Pizarro, standing on foot with his small band of adventurers. And for a moment the two worlds looked into each other's eyes and saw reflections that neither could fully comprehend. The conversation that followed was conducted through interpreters who struggled to bridge not just the gap between languages, but the chasm between world views. When the Spanish priest offered Atahualpa a Bible and attempted to explain the Christian religion, the emperor examined the book with curiosity before throwing it to the ground, unable to understand why he should venerate an object that seemed to have no inherent power or beauty. When Pizarro demanded that Atahualpa acknowledge the authority of the Spanish king, the emperor responded with confused silence, unable to comprehend how someone he had never met could claim authority over lands that had been governed by his family for generations. The signal for the ambush came when the priest declared that the emperor's rejection of Christianity justified whatever action the Spanish might take. The hidden soldiers burst from their concealment with war cries that echoed off the surrounding mountains, their steel weapons glinting in the sunlight as they fell upon the unarmed Inca nobles who had come to the meeting in trust and good faith. The slaughter that followed was brief but devastating, the Spanish weapons cutting through Inca resistance like a hot knife through soft wax. The emperor's bodyguards, armed with weapons of wood and stone, were helpless against steel swords and armor, their courage useless in the face of technology they had never encountered. Within minutes, thousands of the empire's finest nobles lay dead or dying in the plaza. their blood staining the stones that had been laid by craftsmen who had believed they were building for eternity. Atahualpa himself was captured alive, pulled from his golden litter, and bound with chains that seemed impossibly heavy for such a small man to carry. The emperor of the greatest empire in the Americas had become a prisoner of fewer than 200 foreign adventurers, his capture marking the moment when the old world tweed, and something entirely new and terrible was born in its place. The news of the disaster spread across the empire with the speed of wildfire, carried by runners whose voices cracked with grief as they repeated the impossible message. The Son of the Sun had been captured by strangers. The divine order had been shattered by men who recognized no law but their own ambition. In villages throughout the Andes, people gathered in the plazas to hear the reports and to try to understand how the world they had known could have changed so completely in the space of a single morning. The stranger had come to the gates, and nothing would ever be the same again. The fall of Atahualpa. In the stone chamber where the emperor of the largest empire in the Americas sat chained like a common criminal, the light that filtered through the narrow window seemed dimmed by the weight of catastrophe. Atahualpa, who had been carried on golden litters and worshipped as the living son of the sun god, now found himself reduced to a bargaining chip in a game whose rules had been written by men who understood neither honor nor the sacred nature of imperial authority. The room itself was a mockery of the palaces where he had spent his life, its rough walls and earthen floor a harsh contrast to the golden surfaces and polished stones that had surrounded him since birth. But it was not the physical discomfort that tortured him most severely. It was the knowledge that his capture had created a wound in the cosmic order that might never heal, that the divine harmony his ancestors had spent centuries building was unraveling with each hour that passed. Francisco Pizarro came to visit his royal prisoner with the air of a man who understood that he held in his hands something more valuable than all the gold in the empire. The Spanish conquistador had learned enough about Inca society to realize that the emperor was not just a political leader, but a religious figure whose authority was believed to flow directly from the gods. The capture of such a person was not just a military victory, but a psychological weapon that could paralyze an entire civilization. The negotiations that followed were conducted in an atmosphere heavy with incomprehension and mutual suspicion. Atahualpa, speaking through interpreters who struggled to convey concepts that had no equivalent in Spanish, offered to fill a room with gold in exchange for his freedom. The proposal seemed fantastic to men who had grown up in a world where such quantities of precious metal existed only in the dreams of alchemists and the stories told to children. But the emperor was not speaking metaphorically. He understood the extent of his empire's wealth in ways that his captors couldn't imagine, knew of storehouse after storehouse filled with objects that had been crafted from the substance of the sun itself. The golden vessels that graced the temples, the jewelry that adorned the nobility, the decorative panels that lined the walls of palaces throughout the empire, all of this could be gathered and delivered to satisfy the stranger's incomprehensible hunger for the sacred metal. The room that was to be filled was measured with careful precision, its dimensions recorded by Spanish scribes who wrote in languages that captured not just numbers, but the magnitude of a bargain that would transfer more wealth than most European kingdoms possessed. The chamber was 17 feet long, 12 feet wide, and 9 feet high, a space that would require tons of gold to fill, more precious metal than had ever been assembled in one place in the history of the world. Word of the emperor's ransom spread across the empire like ripples from a stone dropped in still water, carried by messengers who ran along roads that had been built for the efficient transmission of imperial commands. The response was immediate and overwhelming as communities throughout the Andes began the heartbreaking process of stripping their temples and palaces of ornaments that had been blessed by generations of priests and cherished by peoples who understood their spiritual significance. The great Temple of the Sun in Cusco was emptied of treasures that had taken centuries to accumulate, its golden walls stripped bare by priests who wept as they performed the sacrilege that might save their emperor's life. The sun disk that had been the focus of worship for generations was carefully removed from its place of honor, its surface covered with cloths that couldn't hide the fact that it was being taken to satisfy the greed of men who saw it not as a sacred object, but as a commodity to be weighed and valued. From every corner of the empire, the golden objects flowed toward Cajamarca like tributaries feeding a great river. Llama trains loaded with precious cargo moved along the mountain roads, their progress watched by populations who understood that they were witnessing the dismantling of their civilization. The craftsmen who had created these objects watched their life's work disappear into the hands of strangers who appreciated neither the skill that had gone into their creation nor the spiritual power they embodied. The Spanish soldiers who received these deliveries were overwhelmed by the sheer quantity of wealth that was accumulating in their mountain stronghold. Men who had grown up in poverty beyond the imagination of the Inca found themselves surrounded by riches that seemed to come from the realm of fantasy rather than reality. The gold continued to arrive in quantities that strained their ability to store and guard it, creating problems they had never anticipated when they dreamed of the wealth that conquest might bring. But even as the ransom accumulated, other forces were at work that would make the emperor's hopes of freedom meaningless. The diseases that the Spanish had carried with them from the Old World were spreading through the empire with devastating efficiency, killing people who had no immunity to sicknesses that were as common as breathing in Europe. The smallpox and measles and typhus moved faster than the news of their coming, leaving behind populations decimated by plagues that seemed to strike without warning or mercy. The political structure of the empire, already weakened by the civil war between Atahualpa and his brother, began to collapse under the pressure of crisis and confusion. Provincial governors found themselves cut off from the central authority, forced to make decisions based on incomplete information and competing loyalties. Some chose to submit to the Spanish in hopes of preserving their local power. Others attempt to organize resistance that was doomed by the technological advantages of the invaders. In the chamber where the ransom was being stored, Spanish goldsmiths worked day and night to melt down objects of incredible artistry and transform them into ingots that could be more easily divided among the conquistadors. Vessels that had been shaped by craftsmen who understood that they were working with divine substance were reduced to anonymous bars of metal, their beauty and meaning sacrificed to the Europeans' inability to appreciate anything that could not be measured in terms of weight and purity. Atahualpa watched this destruction with the anguish of a man who was witnessing not just the loss of material wealth, but the systematic dismantling of everything that had given meaning to his world. Each object that was melted down represented not just gold, but generations of skill and devotion, not just metal, but the accumulated prayers of peoples who had understood their relationship with the divine through the medium of sacred art. The Spanish, meanwhile, began to realize that their prisoner had become more of a liability than an asset. The emperor's continued existence served as a rallying point for resistance throughout the empire, a symbol of legitimacy that could be used by anyone who wished to oppose Spanish rule. The gold that had been collected represented wealth beyond their wildest dreams, but it would be meaningless if they could not maintain control of the territory from which it had come. The decision to execute Atahualpa was made in councils where Spanish officers debated the relative merits of keeping him alive as a puppet ruler versus eliminating him as a threat to their continued dominance. The legal justification for his death was constructed around charges that seemed absurd to anyone who understood Inca law and custom, but provided the facade of legitimacy that the Spanish needed to satisfy their own consciences. The emperor was accused of treason against a king he had never acknowledged, of practicing a religion that his accusers had never attempted to understand, of ordering military actions in defense of his own territory against foreign invaders. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice that satisfied neither Spanish law nor Inca tradition, a proceeding that convinced no one except those who had already decided on the verdict they wished to reach. The execution was carried out in the same plaza where Atahualpa had been captured, the stones that had been stained with the blood of his nobles now witnessing the death of the man who had been their emperor. The method chosen was strangulation, a form of death that the Spanish claimed was more merciful than burning, but which to the Inca represented a particular horror because it prevented the soul from making the journey to the next world in the proper manner. As the life left the emperor's body, those who witnessed the execution understood that they were seeing not just the death of a man, but the end of a world. The divine order that had governed the empire for generations had been broken in a way that could never be repaired. The sacred chain of succession that connected the rulers to the gods themselves had been severed by men who recognized no authority higher than their own ambition. The news of Atahualpa's death spread across the empire like a wave of darkness, carried by messengers who struggled to find words for a catastrophe that lay beyond the boundaries of normal human experience. In communities throughout the Andes, people gathered in stunned silence to try to comprehend how the son of the sun god could have been murdered by strangers, how the cosmic order could have been shattered so completely and so suddenly. The golden room that had been filled with the empire's treasures stood empty now, its contents distributed among Spanish soldiers who counted their shares with the satisfaction of men who had achieved wealth beyond their wildest dreams. But the wealth they had gained had been purchased at a price that they could not calculate, bought with the destruction of a civilization that had taken centuries to build and could never be rebuilt. The empire that had stretched from sea to shining sea, that had built roads through impossible terrain and cities among the clouds, that had learned to live in harmony with forces that governed the movement of the stars and the changing of the seasons, had been reduced to a source of gold for men who understood neither its achievements nor its dreams. The fall of Atahualpa marked not just the death of an emperor, but the beginning of a darkness that would cover the Andes for centuries to come. In the high places where the air was thin and the stars seemed close enough to touch, the wind carried the sound of weeping across valleys that had once echoed with songs of celebration. The children of the sun had been orphaned, their father murdered by strangers who had come from beyond the edge of the world to steal the light that had given meaning to countless lives. The golden age had ended, and the world would never shine with the same brightness again. The Death March. Across the sacred valleys where terraces had once stepped down mountainsides like green prayers, a different kind of procession now moved through the morning mist. These were not the ceremonial parades that had celebrated the harmony between heaven and earth, but columns of people torn from their homes, driven by men whose armor clinked with each step and whose horses left hoofprints in soil that had been blessed by generations of careful cultivation. The conquistadors had discovered that gold was only the beginning of the wealth the land could provide. In the mines of Potosi, where a mountain of silver rose from the earth like a gift from the gods, they found deposits that would fuel Spanish ambitions for centuries. But the extraction of this wealth required labor, vast armies of workers who could survive the thin air and brutal conditions of the high-altitude mines. The Inca people, who had built their civilization in harmony with the mountains, were to become the instruments of their own land's destruction. The meter system, as the Spanish called it, transformed the empire's traditional labor obligations into something that bore no resemblance to the reciprocal relationships that had once bound communities together. Where Inca rulers had asked for work that benefited the entire society, building roads, constructing temples, maintaining the infrastructure that supported all life, the Spanish demanded labor that served only their own enrichment, work that left the land scarred and the people broken. Mama Chuya walked with her children along paths that had once carried her ancestors to festivals and markets, to visits with relatives and pilgrimages to sacred sites. Now these same roads led to destinations that existed only in nightmares, places where the earth had been torn open and the mountain spirits driven away by the endless hunger for metal that lay hidden in the rock. Her youngest son, barely old enough to walk the distance required, stumbled along beside her with the determination of a child who understood that falling behind meant being left to die. The Spanish overseers who managed these human columns rode horses that seemed as alien in this landscape as their masters, creatures whose breath steamed in the thin air and whose eyes held no recognition of the sacred nature of the places they were traversing. These men had learned to see the Inca people not as the children of an ancient civilization, but as resources to be managed, labor to be directed, problems to be solved through the application of sufficient force. The diseases that had begun with the first Spanish landings continued their invisible march of destruction, moving through populations that had no defense against sicknesses their ancestors had never encountered. Smallpox created lesions that covered the body like a map of suffering, while typhus burned through villages with such intensity that entire communities simply ceased to exist. The traditional healers, whose knowledge had been accumulated over generations of studying the relationship between plants and human health, found themselves powerless against afflictions that seemed to come from another world. In the mining camps that sprawled around Potosi like ugly scars on the mountain's face, the Inca workers labored in conditions that would have been considered brutal even by the harsh standards of European industry. The thin air that had once been a blessing, connecting the people to the realm of the gods, became a curse that made every breath a struggle and every movement an ordeal. The silver that they extracted was loaded onto ships that would carry it across the ocean to finance wars and luxuries that had nothing to do with the lives of those who had torn it from the earth. The children who had been born into this new world grew up understanding that their heritage was something to be hidden rather than celebrated, that the traditions of their ancestors were obstacles to survival rather than sources of strength. They learned Spanish words before they learned Quechua, Christian prayers before they heard the songs that had connected their people to the cycles of the seasons. The quipu that had recorded the wisdom of generations were burned as pagan objects, their knotted messages lost forever in flames that consumed not just string and fiber, but the accumulated knowledge of a civilization. Yet even in the midst of this systematic destruction, something of the old ways persisted. In hidden valleys, where the Spanish presence was still light, communities continued to practice the rituals that had sustained them for centuries. The terraces were still maintained with the patience of people who understood that the relationship between human and land was sacred, that the mountains would remember how they had been treated long after the Spanish had taken what they wanted and departed. The resistance that emerged was not the kind of organized military opposition that European strategists would have recognized, but something more subtle and enduring. It lived in the songs that mothers sang to their children, in the patterns that weavers worked into their textiles, in the ceremonies that continued to be performed in secret, maintaining connections to the divine forces that had always governed Andean life. Tupac Amaru, a descendant of the royal bloodline who had escaped the initial Spanish conquest, moved through the mountains like a ghost from the old world, gathering followers who remembered what had been lost and dreamed of what might be restored. His was not an army in the European sense, but a movement of people who understood that they were fighting not just for political independence, but for the right to exist as themselves, to practice their religion, to maintain their relationship with the land that had shaped their ancestors for countless generations. The battles that were fought in this resistance were unlike the formal conflicts that had characterized European warfare. They took place in terrain that favored those who understood the moods of the mountains, who could read the weather patterns and use the altitude itself as a weapon against enemies whose bodies had not been shaped by generations of life in the heights. The Spanish found themselves fighting not just an enemy, but an environment, struggling against air that seemed too thin to breathe and cold that penetrated even the finest armor. But the technological advantages that had enabled the initial conquest remained decisive. The horses that could carry Spanish soldiers across terrain that would exhaust men on foot, the steel weapons that could cut through any armor the Inca could produce, the gunpowder that could breach walls that had been built to last forever. All of these continued to give the invaders overwhelming superiority in any direct confrontation. The capture and execution of Tupac Amaru marked the end of the last organized resistance to Spanish rule, but it also marked the beginning of a different kind of struggle, one that would be fought not on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of people who refused to forget who they had been. The Spanish might control the bodies of the Inca people, might force them to work in mines and plantations, might require them to attend Christian services and speak European languages, but they could not reach the place where memory lived, where the songs of the ancestors continued to echo through dreams and visions. The women who had once woven textiles that told the stories of their people now created patterns that seemed innocent to Spanish eyes, but carried coded messages of resistance and remembrance. The designs that appeared to be merely decorative actually preserved the knowledge of agricultural cycles, of astronomical observations, of religious ceremonies that could not be performed openly but had to be maintained in secret until the time came when they could once again be practiced in the light. The festivals that the Spanish permitted, thinking them harmless expressions of native culture, became vehicles for maintaining connections that ran deeper than any political authority could reach. Dances that appeared to be simple entertainment actually reenacted historical events, preserved genealogies, and transmitted knowledge that would have been lost if it had not been hidden in plain sight. The children who were forced to attend Spanish schools, where they were taught to read and write in languages that had been imposed upon them, sometimes used these new skills in ways their teachers never intended. They learned to write in Spanish, but thought in Quechua, creating literature that appeared to conform to European models, while actually preserving indigenous ways of understanding the world. The priests who had come to convert the Inca to Christianity found themselves facing a syncretic religion that incorporated Christian symbols and stories into frameworks that remained fundamentally Andean. The Virgin Mary became associated with Pachamama, the Earth Mother who had always been the source of life and fertility. Christ's crucifixion was understood through concepts of sacrifice that had deep roots in indigenous tradition. The saints became intermediaries who could be approached using rituals that predated Christianity by centuries. But for many, the destruction was too complete to allow for such adaptations. Entire communities simply disappeared, their populations reduced by disease, overwork, and despair to numbers too small to maintain the traditions that had defined them. The languages that had captured the subtle differences between types of snow and varieties of potato fell silent, their last speakers taking with them knowledge that could never be recovered. The landscape itself bore the scars of the conquest, its terraces abandoned and crumbling, its irrigation systems broken and overgrown, its sacred sites stripped of the golden objects that had made them shimmer with divine presence. The roads that had connected the empire began to disappear under vegetation that was no longer controlled by human hands, their stone blocks becoming foundations for Spanish buildings that served purposes the original builders never could have imagined. Yet in the highest places, where the air was too thin for Spanish settlement and the climate too harsh for European agriculture, some of the old ways persisted almost unchanged. Small communities continued to live much as their ancestors had, maintaining their relationships with the mountain spirits, performing the ceremonies that ensured the continued favor of the gods, speaking languages that carried within them the accumulated wisdom of countless generations. The march of death that had begun with the Spanish conquest continued for centuries, claiming not just individual lives, but entire ways of being in the world. But it was never complete, never total, never able to eliminate entirely the spark of something that had been born in these mountains and had learned to survive in conditions that would defeat almost any other form of life. In the dreams of the survivors, in the songs that were sung in secret, in the patterns that were woven into textiles when no Spanish eyes were watching, the empire lived on. Reduced, transformed, hidden, but never entirely extinguished, waiting for a time when it might once again see the light of the sun that had given it birth and sustained it through the long darkness of conquest and colonization. Echoes in the Andes. In the morning mist that rose from valleys where the ghosts of terraces still traced their ancient patterns across the mountainsides, something stirred that was older than the Spanish conquest, older than the Inca Empire itself. Something that lived in the stone and the soil and the thin air that had shaped human dreams for thousands of years. The echoes of what had been built and lost continued to resonate through the peaks and valleys, carried by winds that remembered the songs of vanished peoples and the prayers of civilizations that had learned to speak with the mountains themselves. 3 centuries had passed since the last Inca emperor had died in Spanish chains, but the Andes themselves remained unchanged, their peaks still catching the first light of dawn and holding it like promises of renewal, their glaciers still feeding streams that laughed their way down toward valleys where new peoples struggled to make sense of a landscape that had been shaped by the hands and dreams of their ancestors. The descendants of both conquerors and conquered had created something that was neither Spanish nor Inca, but partook of both, a mestizo culture that carried within it the memory of what had been destroyed and the hope of what might yet be built. In the markets of Cusco, where vendors sold textiles that still carried patterns passed down through generations of hidden knowledge, the colors and designs spoke to anyone who knew how to read them of continuities that had survived the worst that history could devise. The archaeologists who began to arrive in the 19th century, carrying with them the tools and methods of modern science, found themselves confronting mysteries that challenged their understanding of what human civilization could achieve. The stones of Sacsayhuaman fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could slip between them, had been cut and shaped using techniques that seemed to defy explanation. The roads that wound through impossible terrain had been built to standards that European engineers were only beginning to approach. Hiram Bingham, the American explorer who stumbled upon Machu Picchu in 1911, found himself face to face with a city that seemed to have been frozen in time, its buildings so perfectly preserved that they appeared to be waiting for inhabitants who had only temporarily departed. The terraces still held soil that had been carried up from the valleys below. The fountains still channeled water through carved channels that sang with different notes depending on the season. The temples still framed views of sacred peaks with the precision of instruments designed to measure the movement of the stars. But it was not just the physical remains that spoke to these modern visitors of the civilization that had once flourished in these heights. It was something more subtle and more powerful, a presence that seemed to inhabit the very air, a sense that they were walking through spaces that had been shaped not just by human hands, but by human souls, by people who had understood their relationship with the landscape in ways that the modern world had forgotten. The Quechua speakers, who still lived in communities scattered throughout the highlands, carried within their language concepts and categories that preserved ways of thinking that predated the conquest by centuries. Their words for different types of reciprocity, their elaborate vocabulary for describing relationships between people and land, their understanding of time as something that moved in cycles rather than straight lines. All of these represented intellectual achievements that the Spanish had never understood and had therefore never been able to destroy completely. The ceremonies that continued to be performed in remote villages, often in combination with Christian rituals that had been imposed by force but had gradually been absorbed and transformed, maintained connections to spiritual realities that the conquistadors had dismissed as superstition, but which modern anthropologists were beginning to recognize as sophisticated systems of knowledge about the natural world and humanity's place within it. The weaving that was still practiced by women in communities throughout the Andes carried within its patterns not just aesthetic traditions, but information systems, ways of recording and transmitting knowledge that had been developed over centuries of refinement. A textile that appeared to an untrained eye to be simply beautiful actually contained within its design information about astronomical cycles, agricultural calendars, genealogical relationships, and spiritual concepts that connected the specific community where it had been created to the larger cosmos of which it was a part. The music that was played on instruments carved from wood that had been blessed by mountain spirits and shaped according to proportions that had been established by generations of experimentation carried within its melodies emotional and spiritual information that could not be conveyed through words alone. The flutes and drums that provided the soundtrack for festivals that combined Christian and indigenous elements created soundscapes that transported listeners to realms of experience that transcended the boundaries between the human and the divine. But perhaps the most powerful echo of the vanished empire was the way that the landscape itself continued to shape the consciousness of those who lived within it. the altitude that made every breath a conscious act, the light that seemed to come from within the mountains themselves, the silence that was so complete it became a form of music. All of these created an environment that encouraged the kind of spiritual awareness that had enabled the Inca to build their civilization in harmony with forces that most modern peoples could barely perceive. The political movements that began to emerge in the 20th century as indigenous peoples throughout the Americas started to reclaim their heritage and demand recognition of their rights, drew inspiration from the memory of what had been achieved in these mountains before the European invasion. The vision of a society that had managed to organize millions of people without developing a money economy, that had built vast networks of infrastructure without wheeled vehicles or iron tools, that had achieved levels of agricultural productivity that modern science was only beginning to understand. All of this provided a model that challenged assumptions about what human civilization could achieve. The environmental crisis that was beginning to threaten the entire planet led some scientists and thinkers to look with new interest at indigenous knowledge systems that had enabled peoples like the Inca to live sustainably in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The techniques of soil conservation that had allowed agriculture to flourish on mountain sides that seemed too steep to farm, the systems of water management that had turned deserts into gardens, the methods of crop breeding that had created varieties of plants that could thrive in conditions that would kill their modern counterparts. All of these represented achievements that offered possible solutions to problems that industrial civilization was struggling to solve. The spiritual traditions that had enabled the Inca to maintain their relationship with the natural world began to attract attention from people who were searching for alternatives to religions and philosophies that seemed inadequate to address the ecological and social crises of the modern era. The understanding of the Earth as a living entity deserving of respect and care, the recognition of the interconnectedness of all life, the commitment to living in harmony with natural cycles rather than in opposition to them. All of these concepts began to resonate with people who were looking for ways to heal the damage that had been done to both human society and the natural environment. The tourists who began to arrive in increasing numbers, drawn by the mystery and beauty of sites like Machu Picchu, found themselves confronting not just archaeological remains, but living questions about the nature of human possibility. Standing in places where the achievements of an ancient civilization were still visible in stone and terrace, many visitors experienced moments of recognition that transcended their normal understanding of what the past could mean to the present. But the echoes that resonated most powerfully through the modern Andes were not just intellectual or spiritual, but deeply personal, touching the lives of individuals who discovered that their own family histories were connected to the great story of rise and fall that had played out in these mountains centuries before. Children who had grown up speaking Spanish and thinking of themselves as Peruvians or Bolivians or Ecuadorians began to learn that their ancestors had been part of something larger and older, that their features carried the genetic memory of peoples who had learned to live where the earth touched the sky. The grandmother who had seemed to know things about the weather that had no explanation in modern meteorology, turned out to be carrying forward knowledge that had been passed down through generations of careful observation, understanding that had been accumulated by peoples who had needed to read the moods of the mountains in order to survive. The patterns she traced in the dirt while telling stories to her grandchildren were not random doodles, but maps of relationships between human communities and natural forces, diagrams of connections that had been the foundation of a civilization. The university students who traveled from cities like Lima and La Paz to study in the rural communities where Quechua was still spoken discovered that they were not just learning a language, but entering a world view, acquiring ways of thinking and feeling that their urban education had never taught them. The concepts they encountered had no equivalent in Spanish or English, words that captured relationships and experiences that could only be understood by people who had maintained their connection to the land and the sky and the cycles that governed all life in the high places. The artists and writers who began to explore their indigenous heritage found in the ruins and the continuing traditions material for works that spoke to audiences far beyond the Andes, creations that used modern media and techniques to express insights and emotions that had their roots in pre-Columbian consciousness. The novels and paintings and films that emerged from this cultural renaissance carried within them the voices of ancestors who had never been allowed to speak for themselves, stories that had been suppressed for centuries but had never been entirely silenced. The political movements that coalesced around the recognition of indigenous rights drew strength not just from contemporary grievances, but from the memory of what had been possible when these peoples had been allowed to govern themselves according to their own understanding of justice and community. The principles of reciprocity and balance that had governed Inca society provided models for alternative approaches to problems that the modern world seemed unable to solve through the methods that had been inherited from European political thought. But perhaps the most profound echo of the vanished empire was the way that the landscape itself continued to teach those who learned how to listen to it. The mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations carried within their stone and snow and wind lessons about permanence and change, about the relationship between human ambition and natural law, about the kind of humility that was required for any civilization to endure. The glaciers that were beginning to retreat as the global climate changed had seen the first humans arrive in the valleys below, had watched the slow development of agriculture and architecture and art, had witnessed the glory of the empire at its height and the devastation of its conquest. Their melting waters carried with them the memory of all that they had seen, flowing down toward oceans that would carry their message to shores where other peoples were struggling with their own relationships to the natural world. The condors that still rode the thermals, rising from the valleys below, had inherited flight patterns that had been established when the roads were busy with chasqui runners and llama trains, when the terraces were green with crops and the cities gleamed with gold. Their circles traced paths through the air that connected the present to the past, their eyes seeing landscapes that bore the faint but persistent marks of human achievement and human loss. The plants that grew in the abandoned terraces, finding their own way without human guidance, were often the descendants of crops that had been developed by Inca agriculturalists, varieties that had been bred for specific conditions and purposes, but which had reverted to forms that were closer to their wild ancestors. Yet even in their feral state, they carried within their genetic structure the accumulated wisdom of generations of careful selection and cultivation, knowledge that could potentially be recovered and applied to the agricultural challenges of the modern world. The stones that had been fitted together with such precision that they seemed to have grown rather than been built continued to demonstrate engineering principles that modern architects and engineers were still struggling to understand. The way they moved with the earth during earthquakes rather than resisting and breaking, the manner in which they distributed weight and stress according to patterns that seemed to anticipate forces that would not be encountered for centuries. All of this represented knowledge that had been encoded in physical structures by people who understood that they were building not just for their own time, but for all time. The water systems that had been carved into the living rock continued to function centuries after their builders had died, channeling streams and springs through courses that seemed to have been designed by the landscape itself. The fountains that still sang in abandoned cities, the irrigation channels that still carried water to fields that had long since returned to wilderness, the aqueducts that still bridged chasms that seemed unbridgeable. All of these testified to an understanding of hydraulic engineering that had been achieved without the mathematical formulas and mechanical tools that modern engineers considered essential. The paths that wound through the mountains, many of them now overgrown and forgotten, still followed routes that had been chosen with perfect understanding of the terrain and the weather patterns and the needs of travelers who moved on foot rather than in vehicles. Walking these ancient ways, modern hikers often found themselves experiencing the landscape in ways that were impossible when traveling by other means, developing relationships with the mountains and valleys that echoed the connections that had sustained the peoples who had originally created these routes. The sacred sites that had been marked by the placement of stones and the construction of platforms continued to demonstrate astronomical alignments that had been calculated with precision that rivaled modern instruments. The windows and doorways that framed specific mountains at specific times of year, the shadows that fell in patterns that marked the changing seasons, the reflections that appeared in pools and polished surfaces during particular celestial events. All of these showed that the builders had understood the cosmos as a unified system in which human activities and natural cycles were intimately connected. The stories that were still told in communities throughout the highlands, often in mixtures of Quechua and Spanish, that reflected the complex history of cultural contact and resistance, preserved not just entertainment, but information, not just myths, but maps of spiritual and practical reality. The tales of how the first people had emerged from caves and lakes, of how the gods had taught humans the arts of civilization, of how the balance between different forces had to be maintained in order for life to continue. All of these carried within them ecological and social wisdom that had been tested by centuries of experience. The festivals that combined Christian and indigenous elements in ways that would have horrified the original Spanish missionaries, but which had gradually been accepted as normal by later generations, demonstrated the resilience of cultural patterns that had deeper roots than any political or religious authority could reach. The processions that followed routes that connected Catholic churches to pre-Columbian sacred sites, the dances that reenacted both biblical stories and indigenous historical events, the music that used European instruments to play melodies that followed indigenous scales and rhythms, all of these showed how deeply rooted traditions could adapt to changed circumstances without losing their essential character. The dreams that came to people who slept in the ruins of ancient cities, who camped on terraces where their ancestors had grown food for the emperors, who walked roads that had carried the messages of a vanished empire, often contained images and insights that seemed to come from sources beyond their own experience. The landscape itself seemed to be a repository of memory, a place where the accumulated consciousness of generations remained accessible to those who approached it with the proper attitude of respect and receptivity. In the thin air of the highest peaks, where the sky was so blue it seemed almost black, and the stars shone with an intensity that made them seem close enough to touch, the echoes of the past seemed strongest. Here, where the empire had placed its most sacred sites, and where the priests had come to communicate with the gods, the boundary between past and present seemed thinner, the voices of the ancestors more audible, the possibility of recovering what had been lost more real. The children who grew up in these places, who learned to walk on paths that had been worn smooth by the feet of countless generations, who played games in plazas that had once echoed with the ceremonies of emperors, who fell asleep to lullabies that carried melodies older than memory, were the inheritors of something that could not be measured in gold or conquered by armies. They carried within their bodies and minds and hearts the living essence of a civilization that had learned to flourish in harmony with some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The sun that rose each morning over the sacred peaks was the same sun that had blessed the Inca emperors, that had shone on the golden walls of Cusco, that had watched the building of Machu Picchu and the conquest of Atahualpa, and all the long centuries of struggle and survival that had followed. Its light fell on landscapes that bore the marks of both achievement and destruction, on peoples who carried within them the genetic and cultural heritage of both victims and survivors, on a future that remained unwritten, but which was already being shaped by the echoes of what had come before. Where the sun never rises. In the deepest valleys of the Andes, where the mist never fully lifts and the shadows of the mountains create twilight that lasts from dawn to dusk, there are places where the old people say the sun never rises, where the light that reaches the ground has been filtered through so many layers of cloud and memory that it carries within it the weight of all that has been lost and the promise of all that might yet be recovered. Here, in these forgotten corners of the world, the descendants of the Inca Empire continue their ancient dialogue with forces that modern civilization has forgotten how to hear. They are not living in the past, but carrying the past forward, weaving it into the present like threads in a textile that tells a story too complex for any single lifetime to contain, too important for any one generation to let slip away into the silence that swallows civilizations when their voices are no longer heard. The grandmother who sits in the doorway of her adobe house, her hands working yarn that has been spun from the wool of llamas whose bloodlines stretch back to animals that grazed in the shadow of Sacsayhuaman, is not simply preserving a craft, but maintaining a conversation. Each movement of her fingers follows patterns that were established by women who learned their skills in the workshops of Cusco, who created textiles for ceremonies that honored gods whose names are still whispered in the wind that moves through the valleys. The patterns she creates are not arbitrary decorations, but forms of writing, ways of recording information that do not depend on alphabets or books, but live in the memory of hands that have learned to think through the medium of fiber and color. The red that appears in certain sections carries the memory of cochineal insects that were harvested according to cycles established by astronomers who watched the movement of the stars. The blue that flows through other areas holds within it the essence of plants that were cultivated in gardens where every species was chosen for its sacred as well as practical properties. The young man who works the terraces that climb the mountainside behind the village moves through his daily tasks with a rhythm that connects him to farmers who shaped these same slopes centuries before his birth. The tools he uses are made from metals that were smelted using techniques that have been passed down through generations of smiths who understood that working with earth and fire was a form of prayer, a way of participating in the ongoing act of creation that connected human labor to divine purpose. The crops he tends are not the hybrid varieties that have been developed by modern agricultural science, but ancestral species that carry within their genetic structure the accumulated wisdom of peoples who bred them for conditions that exist only in these heights. The potatoes that grow in his highest field can survive frosts that would kill their lowland cousins, their flesh dense with nutrients that have been concentrated by adaptation to an environment where every calorie must justify its existence. The festivals that mark the turning of the seasons in this community blend elements that would seem contradictory to observers who think in terms of pure categories, who believe that traditions must be either indigenous or European, either ancient or modern. The procession that winds through the village streets on the feast day of the local patron saint follows a route that connects the Catholic Church to sites that were sacred long before the year 2001 Spanish priest arrived in the valley, creating a pilgrimage that honors both Christ and Pachamama, both the Virgin Mary and the mountain spirits who control the weather and the harvest. The music that accompanies these celebrations is played on instruments that represent the meeting of worlds, flutes carved from wood that grows only at certain altitudes, combined with drums that follow rhythms established by the heartbeat of the earth itself. The melodies that emerge from this combination carry within them both the sorrow of conquest and the joy of survival, both the mourning for what has been lost and the celebration of what continues to endure. The children who dance in these festivals learn movements that their bodies seem to remember before their minds understand them, steps that follow patterns encoded in muscles and bones by generations of practice, gestures that connect them to the cosmic dances that govern the movement of planets and the changing of seasons. They are not performing for tourists or preserving culture for its own sake, but participating in rituals that maintain the balance between human community and natural forces that keep open the channels of communication between the visible and invisible worlds. The language they speak carries within its vocabulary concepts that have no equivalent in Spanish or English, words that describe relationships and experiences that can only be understood by people who have maintained their connection to the land and the sky and the cycles that govern all life in the high places. Their grammar encodes ways of thinking about time and space and causation that offer alternatives to the linear logic that has shaped Western civilization, suggesting possibilities for understanding reality that might provide solutions to problems that industrial society has been unable to solve. The stories they tell around fires that burn with the patience of people who understand that time moves differently in the mountains than it does in the cities below preserve not just entertainment, but instruction, not just myths, but maps of territories that exist in the realm of spirit as well as geography. The tales of how the first Inca emerged from a cave at the beginning of time, of how the sun and moon were created from the love between divine beings, of how the balance between opposing forces must be maintained in order for life to continue. All of these carry within them ecological and social wisdom that has been tested by centuries of experience. The healers who still practice the medicine that was developed in the great universities of Cusco work with plants that have been cultivated and studied for generations, substances that have been proven to treat conditions that modern pharmacology is only beginning to understand. Their knowledge of the human body and its relationship to the natural environment represents the accumulation of scientific observation that stretches back to times when the difference between medicine and magic, between chemistry and ceremony, had not yet been established by cultures that insisted on separating what indigenous peoples understood to be intimately connected. The dreams that come to people who sleep in these valleys, where the air carries the memory of volcanic ash and glacier melt, often contain visions that seem to come from sources beyond their own experience. The landscape itself serves as a repository of consciousness, a place where the accumulated wisdom of vanished civilizations remains accessible to those who approach it with the proper attitude of respect and receptivity. The sacred sites that dot the region, caves where offerings have been left for centuries, springs where the water emerges from the earth with temperatures that suggest connection to forces deep beneath the surface, platforms where the alignment of stones creates acoustic effects that amplify the human voice in ways that seem designed for communication with beings who inhabit other dimensions of reality. All of these continue to function as they were intended, providing focal points for practices that maintain the connection between human consciousness and the larger intelligence that governs the cosmos. The political movements that have emerged in recent decades as indigenous peoples throughout the Americas have begun to reclaim their heritage and demand recognition of their rights, draw inspiration not just from contemporary grievances, but from the memory of what was achieved when these peoples were allowed to govern themselves according to their own understanding of justice and community. The principles of reciprocity and balance that governed Inca society provide models for alternative approaches to problems that the modern world seems unable to solve through the methods that have been inherited from European political and economic thought. But the revolution that is taking place in these hidden valleys is not primarily political, but spiritual, not focused on changing governments, but on recovering ways of being human that have been suppressed for centuries, but never entirely destroyed. The people who are leading this transformation understand that the crisis facing the modern world cannot be solved through technological fixes or political reforms alone, but requires a fundamental shift in consciousness, a return to ways of understanding the relationship between humanity and nature that were developed by civilizations that learned to live sustainably in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. The universities that are being established to preserve and transmit indigenous knowledge represent attempts to create institutions that can bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and modern needs, that can translate concepts developed by peoples who thought in terms of cycles and relationships into forms that can be understood and applied by societies that have been shaped by linear thinking and mechanical metaphors. Oh, the students who attend these schools learn not just facts and techniques, but ways of perceiving reality that offer alternatives to the reductionist approaches that have dominated Western education. The global climate crisis that threatens the stability of industrial civilization has led some scientists and policymakers to look with new interest at indigenous knowledge systems that enabled peoples like the Inca to live in harmony with natural cycles rather than in opposition to them. The techniques of soil conservation that allowed agriculture to flourish on mountainsides that seemed too steep to farm, the systems of water management that turned deserts into gardens, the methods of crop breeding that created varieties of plants that could thrive in conditions that would kill their modern counterparts. All of these represent achievements that offer possible solutions to problems that technological civilization is struggling to address. The spiritual traditions that enabled the Inca to maintain their relationship with the natural world have begun to attract attention from people throughout the world who are searching for alternatives to religions and philosophies that seem inadequate to address the ecological and social crises of the modern era. The understanding of the Earth as a living entity deserving of respect and care, the recognition of the interconnectedness of all life, the commitment to living in harmony with natural cycles rather than in opposition to them. All of these concepts resonate with people who are looking for ways to heal the damage that has been done to both human society and the natural environment. But perhaps the most profound gift that the descendants of the Inca offer to the modern world is not any specific technique or knowledge, but an example of what human resilience can achieve, a demonstration that civilizations can survive the worst that history can devise if they maintain their connection to sources of meaning and purpose that lie deeper than any political or economic system. The peoples who have preserved the essence of Inca civilization through 5 centuries of oppression and marginalization prove that it is possible to maintain alternative ways of being human, even under the most adverse circumstances. That the diversity of human consciousness that gives our species its greatest strength can survive even the most determined efforts to eliminate it. In the places where the sun never rises, where the light that reaches the ground has been filtered through layers of cloud and memory until it carries within it the accumulated wisdom of all the generations who have lived and died in these mountains, the future is being born. It is not a future that returns to the past, but one that recovers from the past what is still living and valuable, that weaves ancient wisdom into new forms that can address the challenges of a world that desperately needs alternatives to the paths that have led it to the edge of ecological and social collapse. The children who grow up in these valleys, who learn to read the mood of the weather in the behavior of the clouds, who understand that their individual lives are part of a story that began before the first human footprint was pressed into the mud beside mountain lakes and will continue long after the last star has burned out in the sky, carry within them the seeds of civilizations that have not yet been born. They are the inheritors of more than genetic material or cultural traditions. They are the carriers of consciousness itself, the guardians of ways of being human that the world cannot afford to lose. Though the empire fell, the mountains still remember, and the sun still rises over the sacred valleys of the Andes.